Welcome to Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. Legal issues simplified through real client stories and real-world experiences. Creating simplicity in 3, 2, 1.
Welcome back to another episode of Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. I'm your host, ByrdAdatto, with my co-host, Michael Byrd.
Thanks, Brad. As a business and healthcare law firm, a client call is usually a request for help. The problem lies with the client's timing on when they ask for help. Sometimes they ask for help long after they made a decision that was set to doom an opportunity from the start.
Yes, Michael, timing is key. It makes a big difference both in the size of the problem and eventually the outcome. And sometimes timing is something that we just can't fix. And often we've heard, if those have heard other episodes, heard us talk about the 550 rule, where you either pay us $5 up front to do it in the right, or $50 at the back end, or as one of our clients call it, the $50,000 rule. But either way, it's a painful discovery.
Yes, for sure. Brad, are you familiar with the D.I.Y movement that we have seen across all aspects of our lives in recent years?
Yes, the D.I.Y. Do it yourself. Yes, and why?
YouTube can make you a so-called expert on anything. Do you have any, Brad, do you have any home improvement projects or other DIY projects where you were doomed to fail from the start?
I can say I've absolutely made my mistakes over the years, especially with DIY home improvement moments. When I first bought my first house, I did paint every single room in the house, so I felt pretty sufficient. Mm-hmm. And then when it came to the caulking of a bathroom, not so bueno. And then I started to get more complex renovations. It got worse. So I quickly learned that I actually had a really good skill set with my DIY, which is picking up the phone and calling someone else and paying them to do it. How about you?
Yeah, I like that as well. Well, I'm going to share something with you, Brad, that it's just between us, so don't tell anyone.
I won't tell. And don't worry, no one's listening.
Okay, good. And actually, you probably will remember this story. My biggest fail happened in advance of my wedding in 2013. As you know, our family story is complicated. We're a blended, adoptive family. So my daughters needed to be measured for bridesmaids' dresses. And my wife, Stephanie, gave me the sheet that needed to be filled out for their measurements so that she could cut their dresses.
Seems normal.
Yep. That night I looked at the sheet and thought, I don't need to go to a tailor to get that measured. I can just do it myself.
Sure.
I didn't have a tape measure though.
Oh.
But I did have a ruler.
Oh, okay.
So I found, as any good DIY person would, a solution. I found a piece of string and I took the measurements with the string of both of my daughters. And then, of course, measured the string with the ruler, so I could actually give the results. I didn't tell my, at the time, future wife how I took the measurements because I didn't even think twice about it.
Yeah,
That seemed all logical.
Very.
A few weeks before the wedding, both dresses came back and they were way too small. And I don't mean like oh, wow, that was just a size too small. I mean like, for my daughter who was in high school, probably would have fit her when she was about 8 or 9 years old. They were unusable. And so I explained to my wife what I had done because I couldn't understand why they were so off. And as you might imagine, she was horrified.
Yes.
We ended up having to pay double to put a rush on 2 brand new dresses just a few weeks out from our wedding. We laugh about it now, but it was definitely not funny at the time.
Yes. First, I absolutely remember this story well. Great epic fail, Michael. Congratulations. And it's actually a perfect example of the 550 rule. Second, we're all still surprised that Stephanie decided to marry you anyway. So your DIY solution was doomed from the start, it sounds like.
Yes, for sure. Yeah, it was. I gained some serious wisdom towards the solution we both have identified, which is having someone else help and stay away from the DIY. Mm-hmm. As we've seen this movement grow, probably because of YouTube, we're now seeing it go into more risky areas. I know you and I have talked about these websites where you can buy Botox and other medical products online, and then do it yourself at home.
Yeah, that sounds like a great idea. Sticking a needle in your face with no medical training, that's like saying, here, hold my beer while I juggle some chainsaws.
Exactly. Well, that brings us to today's story. We had a surgeon client who decided to build his own exit plan and was doomed from the start.
Michael, our first vocabulary word today, exit plan. In the context of what we're referencing with medical practices or other small businesses, the exit plan is the strategy to eventually sell the business that the owner has built. And I think we'll discuss a lot of that in detail in this story.
Yeah. So several years ago, we were hired to help a surgeon make his associate a partner in his practice. This was another step in selling the practice to his colleagues that had joined our client out of fellowship training several years previous. Our client is one of the most giving people we've worked with, and a quality that is just reiterated by anyone that knows them and loves them. And so we will call our client for this story Dr. Generous.
Good name. There's nothing unusual about this in the story that you're about to give. In fact, we have several of these types of projects that are ongoing at any given time.
Yeah, there was nothing that stood out. I remember you and I talking about it right afterwards. And, doctor that joins the practice out of school has been there and is going to become a partner, as the business as usual, something we deal with all the time. They all have their different obstacles, but it just seemed like no big deal.
Yeah, well, maybe as stories go, maybe this is the point where we should ask Rob, our podcast engineer, maybe he should start cueing the forbidding music, because I feel like something like that's about to happen.
Well, that's probably fair since it made it into a story about when to ask for help. But yeah, there were several factors at play that created obstacles to this transaction. And we talked about those things, but ultimately there was one fatal DIY mistake that doomed the relationship from the start. And really, you and I didn't even talk about that doomed factor at the beginning because you couldn't see it yet. It was kind of hidden. It was hidden in plain sight, but it was not until you really got into it that you realized that it was dooming the entire deal.
I like this. So we have a mystery with some scary music playing in the background. So let's break down these obstacles and touch on the very first one. So as you said, we worked on this one together, and we both know one of the biggest obstacles was the actual value of this particular practice.
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to sell a practice, you have to know what the value is, and there's a lot to unpack there. But here, Dr. Generous is a famous surgeon. His practice was, what we call an outlier practice with extremely high revenues and a lot of factors that yielded a really high valuation by a third-party valuation company. And this actually posed a challenge because the practice was worth so much, and we had to figure out a way to structure it so that this associate could afford it, to buy into it. And so as we introduce the associate into the story, we'll call him Dr. Nervous.
All right. So we have Dr. Generous, and now we have Dr. Nervous. But, you and I have dealt with this type of issue many times where the founder has built such a valuable business, it's difficult to determine how to bring on that new owner. And I know we'll discuss some creative solutions as we go throughout today. But for our audience, why the name Dr. Nervous?
Well, this was actually the second obstacle that we faced. Dr. Nervous suffered from analysis paralysis. So we had an ongoing challenge from the discussions screeching to a halt whenever Dr. Nervous got stuck. So think about, as you remember, Brad, we would come to an obstacle, come up with some ideas on how to be creative, share that with Dr. Nervous and his attorney, who's still a good friend of ours, and things would just go to a screeching halt because he couldn't figure out what to do with it.
Yeah, that was challenging, but not insurmountable. So obstacle 1, valuable practice, check. Obstacle 2, analysis by paralysis, check. Michael, do we have a third obstacle?
Yes, Dr. Nervous had been an employee for 7 years at the time of the discussions. Because Dr. Nervous had contributed as a surgeon to the practice for so many years, the waters start getting muddied as to what value Dr. Nervous had created himself for the practice. And this is a long time for an associate to be an employee, under this D.I.Y. model that Dr. Generous had created. And so it was an obstacle to deal with, the problem posed by Dr. Nervous of why am I going to pay for something I created?
Yeah, and we're going to get more into the model. I think we should save that to after our break. But let's focus on why this particular DIY exit plan was doomed from the start.
And this is the one that was hidden in plain sight. And, we often see that people's greatest gifts can also be their greatest weakness. Dr. Generous was way too generous in what he paid Dr. Nervous as an associate over the 7-year period. Yeah,
and what we remember is that Dr. Nervous, as you said, been there for 7 years, was a high producer. He made a lot of money but he also made a lot of money as an employed physician.
Yeah, and Dr. Generous allowed Dr. Nervous to benefit from the ancillary revenues created by the practice.
Ooh, Michael. Second vocabulary word of the day is ancillary revenue. So again, this is a term that's used a lot by attorneys, but it's used in the medical industry. But this references other revenue generated by a particular medical practice not connected to the actual work performed by the physician. So this can include fees generated in the operating room by the facility itself, sometimes called facility fees, or even based on revenues generated by the physician assistants, nurse practitioners, or nurses when they're performing, hey, Michael, you like this word, non-invasive services. And in this case, Dr. Nervous, again, a non-owner, was receiving a lot of these benefits.
Yeah, and the insurmountable challenge was that there was no way to structure the buy-in to the practice without Dr. Nervous taking a huge pay cut for several years. So think about obstacle one. We have an outlier practice that's worth a ton, and then you combine that with this doomed obstacle, which is, why would I buy into something when I'm making so much money, as an employee?
Yep. This problem was amplified by the other obstacles that we'll discuss, but let's go into commercial, Mike, and on the other side, we'll talk about how you could have turned out differently for Dr. Generous had he not tried the DIY and have not known, or if he had known, when to actually ask for help.
Many business owners use legal counsel as a last resort rather than as a proactive tool that can further their success. Why? For most, it's the fear of unknown legal costs. ByrdAdatto's Access Plus program makes it possible for you to get the ongoing legal assistance you need for one predictable monthly fee. That gives you unlimited phone and email access to the legal team, so you can receive feedback on legal concerns as they arise. Access Plus, a smarter, simpler way to access legal services. Find out more. Visit ByrdAdatto.com today.
Welcome back to Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. I'm your host, ByrdAdatto, with my co-host, Michael Byrd. Michael, this season theme is, when should I ask for help? There's a lot to unpack from the Dr. Generous story and the doomed DIY plan when he developed this, when he hired his own associate to buy in his practice. And we've mentioned a lot of things about Dr. Generous and his implementation, but let's talk a little bit about what was doomed about this DIY plan and what he did to make this DIY plan.
Yeah, so, the idea of bringing an associate in with a goal to buy into the practice is a common model. And so doctors commonly follow this model, and it's not YouTube videos, but it's, colleagues that they see, at conferences or in the locker room at the hospital, and they, hear, oh, well, this is how I brought my associate in, and so I'm just going to do that. And there's really no strategy beyond just adopting how someone else did it.
And so you're saying that there's a trick, that there are other strategies to hiring other associates. And I think that's what's important in this particular story is when they're hiring it, there's other strategies that they can come up with.
Yeah, well, and the key word you use, Brad, is strategy. I mean, it is not a strategy to simply adopt what someone else did. Well, it is a strategy, but it may not be a good one. And so, I mean, Dr. Generous knew why he wanted to hire Dr. Nervous, but he didn't know how to design the plan so that it fit both with his goals and with the practice. And we actually, when we give these, lectures at medical conferences, we talk about different exit plans, and this plan is common enough that we have our kind of term of art that we call it the Sensei plan.
Yes, I love that plan. And the idea for the audience is the Sensei plan is you are the founder of the entity, in this case, the physician. So you're the sensei, and you bring on this associate, the grasshopper, and you want to train them about how to be a great doctor and integrate them into your practice, and eventually transition and train them on how to be a great partner with the idea of selling them some or all of your practice.
Yeah, and this model tends to work best with a shorter employment period of 1 to 3 years and then a buy-in. And the strategy is to allow enough time for the associate to become busy and self-sufficient with his or her practice and then move to the buy-in.
Yeah, and ideally you want to design the compensation model so that there is an upward trajectory in the compensation even during the buy-in period.
Yeah, and when you're designing it, there's other factors at play. I mean, you need to design or offer a competitive compensation at the beginning so that you can recruit them. And, there's things Dr. Generous could have done, even offering a competitive comp, that would have improved his chances. He could have shortened the employment period, as we just mentioned, and done the buy-in after about year 3. And there wouldn't have been this huge reliance on this compensation that Dr. Nervous had been making, and this, obstacle of his contribution or perceived contribution to the practice. And then another thing is just not to offer compensation on ancillary revenues in the employment offer to Dr. Nervous.
Yeah, and the ancillary revenues are typically the fruit to be enjoyed only by the owners of a practice, and oftentimes there are a massive number of regulatory reasons why an associate can't even participate or be allowed to participate in the actual ancillary revenues. And we've talked about these regulations in several of our past episodes. But on a very high level, it's based on a lot of federal and state rules, often called the anti-referral law, or sometimes known as Stark laws, known as anti-kickback laws. And whenever a medical provider receives payment for referring a patient to another service, this can trigger these laws. And you're basically paying someone for the volume or the value of their patient referral. And the provider who's actually not performing the services would have to meet some type of applicable exception. And Michael, I could probably spend the next 45 minutes discussing all these exceptions, and even my family members, who are the only loyal listeners we have, all 3 of them, they would actually probably stop listening if I went through all these details. So let's get back a little bit to where we are with today's story.
Well, first, let me acknowledge and agree that, yes, it's super boring to get into that level. And it ends up these laws protect our clients from making this exact mistake because they can't do it often. But here, fortunately for Dr. Generous, it was actually in a state where what he did was compliant, and the structure of his practice made it compliant. But that was just, dumb luck because he did it himself.
Yep.
Yeah. And, but we don't know if Dr. Nervous's analysis paralysis would have prevented even a well-constructed plan from working. But, Brad, when should Dr. Generous have asked for help?
Ideally, the quick answer is that he should have asked for help prior to hiring Dr. Nervous. Beyond the when to ask for help, let's really talk about a bit more about what he could have done at the actually beginning of this.
Totally agree. I mean, we always start with the idea of starting with a practice assessment. Before you can embark on a strategy to transition your practice, you have to know what you have. You have to lift up the hood and take a look.
Yeah, and you need to understand certain aspects of your practice. What is your financial health? What is your legal health? We were just talking about the ancillary piece. operational health, and then obviously all that plays into the overall valuation of the practice, which typically is, once you understand that, really the first major step.
Yeah, I mean, just taking financial health as a category, I mean, you want to look at your different revenue streams and your overhead. Many practices have overhead creep over the years, and particularly when it comes to staff, their loyal staff that's been there forever, and so that impacts your strategy to have an exit plan when you have these kind of warts to your business that just naturally accumulate over the years.
Yeah, and your legal health is really looking at your legal structure and identifying whether there are any compliance issues that need to be addressed prior to actually bringing someone on.
Yeah, I mean, we have so many great stories, Brad, of the legal health. You mentioned one, just as you said a couple times now, with the structure of ancillary revenues. And we have so many, stories of clients. They'll say, hey, I've got 3 different business entities. I've got my medical practice and my surgery center and my medical spa. And then you start looking into it and realize, well, they may have formed those entities, but they're really just running everything through one practice.
Yep.
And you got to figure out, okay, what's the impact of that as you start going towards your plan? The operational health, they're all of these things are similar. But with the operational health, you want to objectively look at the practice through the eyes of an outsider. Do you have family on staff that could create an obstacle? We have so many times where spouses are, also the office manager or a nurse. And, this does create challenges to someone that's looking to buy in. And then, I mentioned this before, but if you have a loyal team that's been with you forever, are they going to buy into working with a new doctor?
Yep. And, we've talked about this as ultimately is you have to understand what is the idea of and trying to find out the idea of what the actual value of your practice is. In this case, Dr. Generous, as we discussed, had an extremely valuable practice and was something to strategize about upfront before he got into this.
Yeah, I mean, he clearly would have benefited by knowing what the value is, because that would impact, trying to create a compensation strategy for Dr. Nervous as an employee. And then, once you know, Brad, what you have on your hands, the doctor, in this case, Dr. Generous, needs to identify his late career goals. It's hard to build a plan if you don't know where you're trying to go.
Yes, we've talked about before, driving or being blindfolded or all these other things. If you don't know where you're going, it becomes a problem. And then, so it's much harder than it sounds. We've helped many doctors over the years who exit the practice, and from the professional, financial, emotional variables that come to play, it gets very difficult. I mean, ultimately, Michael, at the end, this is something they built, and so it's their baby, and they have to figure out how to let go sometimes. Well, Michael, let's tell the audience how this worked out for Dr. Generous.
Well, things did not work out with Dr. Nervous, and he eventually left the practice. That was, in fact, the comp issue did doom it from the start. Thankfully, Dr. Generous was still young and had an amazing practice, and we worked with him to build his exit plan and built a plan that fit his goals and that leveraged all of his great qualities, and particularly his generosity.
Yeah, and what, we were talking about the Sensei plan earlier, but he decided that he wanted to go with a different path, and he just wanted to employ the physicians without their ability to actually have ownership. But Dr. Generous was able to continue to be generous on how he paid them. He created a win-win for the practice to make money, but also hold on to his equity. And Dr. Generous was also able to maintain, more importantly to him, the control of the practice even in his late years at the practice. So, Michael, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, this season we talk about when to ask for help, and inevitably the answer is earlier than when the problem arose. But, what it comes down to is if you have a strategy, no matter what the situation is, in this particular case, we're talking about an exit plan, but having a strategy sets you up for success than just jumping in, feet first and going and then seeing how it works out.
Yes, and as we know, we have a good friend that told us once before, hope is not a plan.
Exactly.
Join us next Wednesday when we have Blind Spot, Partnering with a Friend, and again, we have a special guest joining us. Thanks again for joining us today. And remember, if you like this episode, please subscribe, make sure to give us a 5-star rating, and share with your friends.
You can also sign up for the ByrdAdatto newsletter by going to our website at ByrdAdatto.com.
ByrdAdatto is providing this podcast as a public service. This podcast is for educational purposes only. This podcast does not constitute legal advice, nor does it establish an attorney-client relationship. Reference to any specific product or entity does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by ByrdAdatto. The views expressed by guests are their own, and their appearance on the program does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. Please consult with an attorney on your legal issues.